this segment, we'll be exploring the rise and fall of the House of Medici. Medici, a family name from Florence, Italy, profoundly shaped the course of European politics, culture, and history. Yet, comprehensive accounts of this legendary family are few and far between, which makes the book we are discussing today especially precious. When we think of European history, a picture of distinct social classes often comes to mind: commoners, merchants, the church, and royalty. But the subject of this book, the Medici family, uniquely straddled every one of these strata. How was this possible? They came from common roots and built their fortune through commerce. Over several generations of hard work, they not only amassed wealth that could rival kingdoms and control Europe's financial lifelines, but as mere merchants, they also ruled the Republic of Florence for nearly 300 years, from the 15th to the 18th century. Beyond that, the family produced 3 popes and 2 queens of France. It's worth noting that these queens were no mere figureheads after becoming queen mothers. They became the true power behind the throne, ruling France as regents. To describe the Medici as simply rich and powerful would be a gross oversimplification. Consider that Europe's transition to the modern era was driven by 3 great movements of intellectual liberation: the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. The Medici family had a direct and profound connection to the first 2. Take the Renaissance, for example. The Medici family was a long-term, generous patron of the arts. The 3 masters of the High Renaissance we all know, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, were all discovered and sponsored by them. Even the term Renaissance was first coined by the artist Vasari, who was himself funded by the Medici. They built churches, universities, and libraries, and supported the scientific explorations of Copernicus and Galileo. It is safe to say that without the generosity of the Medici, the splendor of the Renaissance would have been far dimmer. It's impossible to know by how many years Europe's emergence from the Dark Ages into the modern era might have been delayed. Although the Medici line died out over 200 years ago, their name still commands immense respect in Europe, as countless cultural capitals bear its indelible mark. This is especially true of Florence, whose fate was always intertwined with theirs. If you visit today, you can still glimpse the shadow of the Medici in every corner of the city. The Uffizi Gallery, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Convent of San Marco, the Pitti Palace, and the family crests scattered throughout, all speaking to a former glory. In the history of early modern Europe, Medici is a name you simply cannot ignore. Yet, comprehensive books about the family are rare. The first English-language work on the subject did not appear until 1909, and from a modern perspective, it is rife with subjective sentiment. Fortunately, research over the following century became more meticulous, culminating in this definitive work, The Rise and Fall of the House of Medici. In the book, author Christopher Hibbert provides a panoramic view of the Medici's entire history. His account is clear, well-paced, and reveals the family's winding journey from rise to fall and its profound impact on the world. Hibbert is one of the most celebrated British historians and biographers of our time, with over 50 major historical works to his name. These include specialized histories like the History of England, the French Revolution, and Rome, the biography of a city, as well as biographies such as his works on Queen Victoria, Napoleon, and the one we are discussing today. It would be no exaggeration to call him the go-to biographer for Europe's royal and noble houses. At the same time, Hibbert's writing is clear and accessible, while his historical research is remarkably thorough, earning him the admiration of both professional scholars and general readers. The Times of London praised him as the most gifted popular historian of our time. Having introduced the book and its author, I will now guide you through its core content in 4 parts. First, how did the Medici family rise from a humble merchant household to become the de facto rulers of Florence? Second, how did Lorenzo de' Medici lead the family to the zenith of its power? Third, how did the 2 Medici popes command the Holy See in Rome, and how did they trigger the Protestant Reformation? Fourth, how did the once invincible Medici family decline and ultimately exit the stage of history? Let's begin with the first part, the rise of the Medici family. Today, Florence is a historic city and tourist destination in central Italy, but hundreds of years ago, it was an independent, wealthy, and powerful state. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, Italy was fractured for 1,000 years, and Florence was one of its many city-states. By the 15th century, the Republic of Florence was prospering, with many families rising to prominence through trade. The Medici were one of them. In the early 15th century, before Columbus began the Age of Discovery, trade between Europe and Asia required a long and complex overland journey, and Florence was a key stop on this route. This prime location made earning money relatively easy. Florence grew rich from commerce, and with no absolute monarch in the city, the status of merchants soared. Philosophers of the time even argued that only merchants engaged in large-scale business were worthy of respect. It could be said that a Florentine who wasn't in business could barely hold their head up. It was on this tide that a man named Giovanni de' Medici entered the historical stage. Born in 1360, he came from a poor background due to his father's early death. But he was determined to become wealthy through business, preserve his family's fortune, and ultimately become a respectable Florentine citizen. To achieve this, he kept a low profile, focused on making money, and never got involved in public affairs. In 1406, the 46-year-old Giovanni encountered an incredible business opportunity. Florence gained a port on the Mediterranean Sea. He seized the chance, investing heavily in the wool processing industry and making a fortune. However, what made him truly rich was a speculative gamble. At the time, a Neapolitan named Casa was campaigning to become pope. Although from a noble family, Casa had a reputation as a notorious and licentious former pirate. Everyone thought he was just seeking thrills and wasn't serious. Only Giovanni had the foresight to see him as a rare commodity worth investing in. He boldly contributed 10,000 gold florins to Casa's campaign. To others, this looked like a reckless gamble with no chance of a return. But to everyone's astonishment, in 1410, Casa was elected pope, taking the name John XXIII. Giovanni was richly rewarded. He became the Pope's financial agent, managing the wealth of the entire papal court. This not only brought him enormous profits but also allowed him to open branches of his bank across Europe. In just a few years, the Medici Bank became the most profitable family business in all of Europe. The greatest risk in a family business is the heir. Fortunately, the shrewd Giovanni had an even shrewder son, Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo was an outstanding banker, particularly skilled in business management. When selecting branch managers, he boldly promoted and carefully mentored young men, ensuring their absolute loyalty. In customer relations, he never abandoned a loyal client for short-term gain, instead meticulously nurturing every relationship. These connections extended outward, forming a vast and stable network. The Medici Bank thus became a unique and massive financial institution with branches in all major cities, and the name Medici became synonymous with creditworthiness. Cosimo not only solidified the family's economic position but also entered the political arena. Interestingly, his banking business was so successful that he had no initial desire for politics, hoping to remain a low-profile banker like his father. But great prominence inevitably attracts envy. The Medici family's rising fortunes drew the ire of their rivals. The Albizzi family, a rival power in Florence, sought to eliminate the Medici's influence. They fabricated charges, accusing Cosimo of plotting to hire mercenaries to overthrow the Republican government. As a result, Cosimo was sentenced to 10 years of exile. Just as the Medici family seemed on the brink of disaster, a turning point appeared. Shortly after Cosimo left for exile, the Florentine government discovered that without the Medici Bank, it had no money. At the same time, it suffered a military defeat against Milan, and public dissatisfaction with the government reached its peak. And let us not forget, the Pope had always been a staunch ally of the Medici. Ultimately, under the dual pressure of the Pope and public opinion, the sentence was overturned, and Cosimo was allowed to return to Florence. Along the way, he was greeted by cheering crowds of townspeople paying him homage. This ordeal, far from diminishing Cosimo's prestige, actually enhanced it. He realized that, as the wealthiest man in Florence, it was impossible to stay out of politics. Since the people supported him, why not embrace the opportunity to become their leader? And so, Cosimo established a form of signoria in Florence. It was essentially a dictatorship in all but name. He himself held no official government post, but all political decisions required his approval. Members of the governing council would come to his palace to seek his opinion, and ambassadors from other nations would visit him directly at his home. Cosimo became the de facto ruler of the Republic of Florence, honored by the people as Pater Patri, the father of the fatherland. Thus, through the efforts of Giovanni and his son Cosimo, the Medici family truly became a state within a state, not as a metaphor, but as a literal fact. From 1406, when Giovanni seized his business opportunity, to Cosimo's death in 1464, it took just 58 years for the Medici to make the spectacular leap from business titans to rulers of a nation. Next, we move to the second part, the golden age of the Medici family, the great father of the fatherland. Cosimo suffered terribly from gout, and his son Piero was not spared, passing away less than 5 years after taking charge of the family. At this point, Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, stepped onto the stage. He inherited all the family's wealth and power, leading the Medici into their most glorious era. Lorenzo was only 20 at the time, but despite his youth, he possessed immense political talent. Upon taking power, he implemented political reforms that benefited the common people, thereby winning their hearts. But this very reform angered the reigning pope. The pope joined forces with anti-Medici factions and orchestrated an assassination plot. In this conspiracy, Lorenzo's younger brother, Giuliano, was brutally murdered, while Lorenzo himself miraculously survived. In the aftermath, Lorenzo united various factions, purged his political enemies, and saw his prestige soar to unprecedented heights. He became the undisputed leader of Florence, earning the honorific Il Magnifico, or Lorenzo the Magnificent. But the Pope was not finished. The pontiff at the time was Sixtus IV, known in history for his brutality and greed. He used his office to enrich his nephews and brazenly seized lands from other Italian states. Lorenzo's refusal of the Pope's unreasonable demands was the direct cause of the attempt on his life. Seeing that the assassination had failed and Lorenzo's reputation had only grown, the Pope became enraged. He persuaded the Kingdom of Naples, a traditional rival of Florence, to assemble an army to crush the city. War was imminent. Ordinarily, the Neapolitan army wouldn't have been a major threat, as Florence's old ally, the Duchy of Milan, would typically come to its aid. But as fate would have it, the Duke of Milan was assassinated at this very moment, leaving his state in chaos and unable to send help. With enemy forces just 30 miles from the city walls, Florence was on the verge of annihilation. In this moment of crisis, Lorenzo made a decision that stunned everyone. He would go to Naples alone to negotiate with its king. This was like walking straight into the lion's den. But Lorenzo knew the weakness of the Neapolitan king, Ferrante. For historical reasons, the French king had long claimed sovereignty over Naples, a constant threat to Ferrante. Moreover, the Turkish fleet frequently prowled his southern coast. Lorenzo understood that Naples was also surrounded by powerful enemies, and that an alliance with Florence would be a win-win situation. However, King Ferrante was cunning, calculating, and adept at hiding his true intentions, making negotiations extremely difficult. But Lorenzo had a plan. He first sought common ground with the king. Both loved country life, falconry, and hunting, and shared similar tastes in poetry and classical humanism. During the talks, Lorenzo didn't just focus on the current crisis. He subtly referenced the peace-making monarchs of classical antiquity, who were celebrated by posterity, a clever hint to King Ferrante. Lorenzo's understanding of the contemporary political landscape was equally profound. He pointed out that the Pope was only supporting Naples to further his own ambitions and was merely using them for the time being. Florence, on the other hand, could be Naples' true friend. Hiding his inner anxiety, Lorenzo used his exceptional eloquence to navigate the Neapolitan court for an extended period, ultimately securing a peace treaty between the two states. Naples withdrew its army, the Pope was isolated, and the crisis was averted. In 1480, Lorenzo returned to Florence in triumph, receiving a welcome more rapturous than even his grandfather Cosimo's return 46 years earlier. Thereafter, Lorenzo's rule in Florence became even more secure. While Florence was still nominally a republic, Lorenzo was now its de facto dictator. He held no title, but his opinion was the final word. This unique political system even baffled foreign ambassadors, as Lorenzo would repeatedly explain to them that he was merely a private citizen. Despite his immense political success, Lorenzo's business acumen was lackluster, and the Medici Bank nearly went bankrupt under his management. To cover the losses, he first embezzled his cousin's money and later misappropriated state funds. These were certainly not the actions of a private citizen, and some consequently labeled him a tyrant. But Lorenzo's charisma and prestige were so great that others would say, if Florence must have a tyrant, she could never find a better or more delightful one. In their eyes, Lorenzo was a gentle tyrant. Later, the brutal Pope Sixtus IV died and was succeeded by the milder Innocent VIII. Lorenzo seized the opportunity to actively repair relations with the new pope. He bribed the pope's confidants and sent frequent letters and gifts. In his letters, he would always express goodwill and encouragement before casually, almost as an afterthought, presenting his own views. In this gentle manner, Lorenzo gradually influenced and even controlled the pope. Beyond money, the Medici family had found another way to influence Europe. In the 23 years from his rise to power in 1469 to his death in 1492, the Medici family reached its absolute peak. Lorenzo sponsored a vast number of artists and was, without question, the greatest patron of the Renaissance. After his death, the Medici's rule in Florence was temporarily overthrown, and the center of the Renaissance subsequently shifted from Florence to Rome. Now, we move to the third part, the era of the two Medici popes. The Medici family was not exiled from Florence for long. 20 years later, in 1512, they returned to power. But by then, Florence had been ravaged by financial crises and wars and never fully recovered its former glory. So, did the Medici family decline from this point on? Not yet. They would continue to influence Europe from another, more important city, Rome. Rome was the seat of the papacy, the Pope's residence. The great Lorenzo had long realized that having his son in a high position within the church would be a tremendous asset to the family. Knowing it was easier to secure a clerical position in France than in Italy, he instructed the French branch of the Medici Bank to keep a close watch for vacancies. Through his careful planning, his son Giovanni received the tonsure at the age of 8, was recommended for a monastery by the King of France himself, and held over 20 important posts. But Lorenzo's ambitions went far beyond that. He used his good relationship with Pope Innocent VIII to have Giovanni appointed a cardinal, the second highest office in the church. 3 weeks before Lorenzo's death, the 16-year-old Giovanni officially became a cardinal, the youngest in history. Of course, holding a high office did not equate to high morals. Giovanni was lazy and fond of wine and women. But in the debauched environment of Rome at the time, this was hardly remarkable. The city had a population of less than 50,000, yet nearly 7,000 were prostitutes. Giovanni thrived in this setting, comfortably serving as a cardinal for over 20 years. His affable and approachable personality ultimately helped him get elected pope, known to history as Leo X. A man like this becoming pope naturally led to extravagant indulgence. He is said to have told his cousin Giuliano, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." This Giuliano was the posthumous son of Lorenzo's assassinated brother and would later become Pope Clement VII. When Clement VII ascended to the papacy, the Holy See was already a mess, largely because his cousin Leo X had been so profligate. His father, Lorenzo, had sponsored artists in Florence, but Leo X took it to another level in Rome. Raphael was his favorite painter, and he even had him paint a portrait of his pet elephant. Leo X spent money like water on art investments and the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. To raise funds, the church began selling indulgences on a massive scale, an act that directly lit the fuse of the Protestant Reformation. Clement VII inherited his cousin's mess but continued to spend just as lavishly. He commissioned paintings from Raphael, sculptures from Michelangelo, provided lodging for Leonardo da Vinci, and funded Copernicus's astronomical research. But what truly shook his position was the war with the Holy Roman Empire. In 1527, imperial troops sacked Rome, carrying out a brutal pillage. Clement VII was forced to sign a humiliating treaty, and the Renaissance in Rome came to an end. However, Clement VII was not without cunning. In the aftermath, he employed brilliant diplomacy. In 1533, he arranged the marriage of the 14-year-old Catherine de' Medici to the heir to the French throne. Catherine would go on to become queen and then Queen Mother of France, ushering in an era of Medici influence over the French crown. All of this was thanks to the astute foresight of Clement VII. Now for our final part, the decline of the Medici family. Previously, although the Medici had ruled as dictators, Florence remained a republic in name. However, after the turmoil of being overthrown and then returning, they grew tired of this charade. The republic was abolished and replaced with a grand duchy. The Medici heirs finally shed their commoner and merchant identities to become true, titled nobility. The man who completed this transformation was Cosimo I. He was named by Pope Leo X in honor of the father of the fatherland, Cosimo. But this Cosimo was not that Cosimo. Although well-educated, elegant, and possessing a phenomenal memory, Cosimo I's interest lay in being a soldier, not a ruler. He was autocratic and trusted no one. He never revealed his true thoughts, not even to his closest mother and secretary, and made all decisions himself. The lower classes of society supported Cosimo I, not because he offered them great benefits, but because the preceding republic hadn't either. Furthermore, Cosimo I had the backing of Spain. The King of Spain at the time was also the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, whose nation was immensely powerful thanks to wealth from the Age of Discovery. With Spain's help, eliminating his opponents was a simple matter. However, inviting a powerful guest is easy, but getting them to leave is hard. Charles V also wanted to annex Florence into his empire. Fortunately for the Medici, his relationship with the Pope was poor at the time, and he saw the support of the Duke of Florence as a significant strategic advantage. And so, the Medici family's noble title was recognized by the Holy Roman Empire. In 1569, the Pope also officially recognized Cosimo I as Grand Duke. The Medici became the rightful masters of Florence. But by this time, Florence had long lost its former vitality, and Cosimo I could never command the prestige of the magnificent Lorenzo. He was a stern ruler, unforgiving of any mistake from his subordinates, and even established rigid standards for court ceremonies and attire. His moods were unpredictable, and he deliberately cultivated an air of mystery, keeping all his movements strictly secret, unknown even to his servants. To prevent assassination, he even had Michelangelo's student, Vasari, design a corridor so he could travel safely above the city streets. The traits of an absolute monarch had fully manifested in the Medici family, while the tradition of seeing themselves as citizens was gone. From Cosimo I onward, Medici rule continued for several more generations, but they were on an irreversible path of decline. In 1743, the last member of the Medici family died, and a legend that had lasted for 300 years came to an end. Of course, this lamentable history of decline was not without its bright spots. Cosimo I's son, Ferdinando II, once hired a scientist as a tutor for his own son. That scientist was Galileo. Later, when the church persecuted Galileo, the Medici family sheltered him, allowing him to live out his final years in Florence and continue his research. In 1610, Galileo named several newly discovered celestial bodies the Medicean stars in one of his works. Today, when we look up at the night sky, the Medicean stars still shine, a silent tribute to this family's immortal legend. That concludes our exploration of the rise and fall of the House of Medici. Let's recap the 4 main points. 1. The family's rise. Through the efforts of Giovanni and Cosimo, the Medici family rose from a common merchant house to become the de facto rulers of Florence. 2. The family's zenith. Lorenzo the Magnificent maintained national unity, skillfully influenced the papacy, and expanded the family's power across Europe, leading it to its peak. 3. The era of the popes. Popes Leo X and Clement VII led the Holy See in Rome, and their extravagance inadvertently triggered the Protestant Reformation. 4. The family's decline. The Medici eventually became hereditary nobles, but in doing so lost their vitality and began an inevitable decline, ultimately exiting the stage of history. The rise and fall of the House of Medici tells the story of one of the most influential families in European history, a story full of legendary drama. Although we always associate them with Florence, the Medici's influence in fact extended far beyond a single city, profoundly shaping the development of all of Europe and even the world. Interestingly, even today we can still see the shadow of the Medici family around us. For instance, the tomb of the assassinated Giuliano features a marble head sculpted by Michelangelo. Because it was made by the same master as the famous David and has simpler lines, it is affectionately nicknamed the Little David by art students in China, becoming a required subject of study for nearly every aspiring painter. Another example, Pope Clement VII once bestowed the title Defender of the Faith upon King Henry VIII of England. Its Latin abbreviation, FD, was minted on British coins. Hundreds of years later, you can still find these two letters on British currency. If you travel to Europe, traces of the Medici are everywhere. Their coat of arms is on the walls of the Vatican, and the Louvre in Paris houses a cycle of 21 paintings by Rubens depicting the life of Marie de' Medici. And as for Florence, it goes without saying. The last member of the family donated their entire art collection to the city with the stipulation in her will that these treasures could never leave Florence and must remain there for all the world to see. That is all for this installment. Congratulations on finishing another book.